What would be the one lesson about leadership that you would emphasize to these young people that has been most meaningful to you over your career?
I think I'm going to cheat and do 1.5, but and I'm so pleased to be here, and I'm so excited that about the emphasis you and the campus are placing on service, because I think the first piece I would encourage all of you from a student perspective is first who and then what. And I think we often jump right to what am I going to do, and I actually think you need to spend more time really deciding who you want to be and what value system you're going to ascribe to, because the alternative is to default, and then you're really just going to follow yourself. And my experience is that's not the best guidepost, and very hard to have objectivity. And so for me, that's through the lens of my faith. But for whatever value system you have, you've got to, I think, establish what principles or what guideposts you're going to use to evaluate the different opportunities and ways you're going to engage. And then the second part, which I'm thrilled the science followed, my heart, but my old entrepreneurship, Jim Collins, before he became a guru, I love that his research came out with that idea of level 5 leadership. And I aspire, and I think the nonprofit sector requires a model of servant leadership and managing through influence versus authority. I actually think that's the best way to manage any organization, and so it is. I think many of you may be familiar, but as he looked at all these matched pairs and looked at the differentiator, he didn't expect leadership to be part of it. The part that really came out of leadership were what he called a level 5 leader, which had in his words, that paradoxical combination of personal humility and intense determination, ambition for the mission. And I think that's, to me, that's a very appealing combination. And I think one of my favorite writers is C.S. Lewis, and he said, people get confused often about humility, but he said humility is not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. And I think the most important aspect of leadership is to really be all about what you're trying to do and not about you, which gets confused a lot in our world.
It certainly does. A great answer. My next question, Jonathan, is about, you've made some pivots in your career. You've gone from profit to nonprofit. You've pivoted from Goldman Sachs to Best Buy and couple of places in between. Then you pivoted to a 4,300 member Presbyterian church as executive pastor. I'm interested in what has prompted those pivot points in your life. What speaks to you in terms of moving off in a major new direction like that?
Thanks. We had dinner. We were talking about how many of you in the room have had international experiences, and I think in some ways I had a couple of very intentional pivots and a whole lot of, I don't believe in luck, but I would say grace moments that turned into so many of the transitions I didn't try. I think one big pivot for me was I was rather an accidental Wall Street worker and ended up at Goldman, talking my way into a job at Goldman. It's a great firm. I wasn't cut out to be an investment banker, which I learned, though it was a great education. And I was really looking in the mirror after a couple of years on Wall Street and going, wow, I'm not living the kind of life I imagined, and I'm not really living the value system I espouse, so I need to regain perspective. So instead of applying to grad schools, I applied for a bunch of opportunities and had what for me was a life-changing year living in Korea with the help of the Henry Luce Foundation, and that was foundational in so many ways when I look back. It unleashed sort of a new, deeper love of sort of exotic or other parts of the world. More importantly, it created space to regain. I had a lot of time to think and ponder and come to grips with my faith. I was living in the Olympic training camp with all the Korean coaches and athletes, and it was such a complete change from anything I'd ever experienced. And that was I would say, reset the foundation. I came back from that thinking long-term I wanted to do something missional and something in nonprofit management, but with the idea I could learn how to do that in the private sector and then bring it across. I would say my whole private sector career, looking back, makes sense. At the time, things just kept coming along, and I would say I was opportunistic, and interesting opportunities sort of caught my imagination. The next big pivot was leaving the private sector and my intent was to go into nonprofit work, and it's so interesting. Axiom I like is God's timing is perfect but rarely convenient, and so I think, and I would say the lens I'm going to speak through, because my career only makes sense in that context, is from my personal faith. I think, again, for everybody, that's a very personal thing of how you make those big decisions. But I left the business world, had a very impactful trip to India where God just kind of broke my heart around poverty issues, and came back thinking, I'm going to go work around global poverty issues, and then all the doors closed, and I had, it was sort of shocking. I hadn't had to look for a job in a very long time, and I almost got a couple of big nonprofit jobs, and both times I got to the finals and didn't get the job. I turned down some really good business jobs because I thought God was really clear about where I was supposed to go, and then I started thinking maybe I missed something here or got this wrong, and went through this gap period that was such an important part, I think, of getting ready for the next season. It was a great time for my family. It was not a great time for my ego, but that was actually a good thing. And I had an avocation of coaching pastors and helping with church leadership, and that led to my church asking if I would come and lead the church, which I was not at all looking to do. And all my friends said, this is a bad idea. This is not a good career move. Don't do this. Nobody will hire you if you don't like it, and it's a mistake. And
no politics more difficult than church politics.
Exactly. Right? But I thought, I look, and it was the perfect complement. Even though I was not looking when Habitat came calling, it was the perfect complement to get me ready for Habitat, which has just been sort of, to me, this wonderful intersection. I was looking to sort of merge vocation and avocation, and I think it was a great seasoning time and a great learning lesson too, because I was impatient at the time, but I think all of that, you can often look back and see how all of that made sense.
It reminds me of a commencement address that Isabella Cannon, class of 24, former mayor of Raleigh, North Carolina, gave, and she said, "Be open to surprises." And that, I think you followed that advice, taking that less traveled road.
There was a very nice story that I can now say more confidently, because the last job I looked at when I took the church job, I was talking to a headhunter from one of the big firms, and it was to run an internet retail company, and it was a great job. And I was like, oh, that's a great job. I'm going to go work for my local church. And I thought, I will never hear from you again. And then she was the partner who led the Habitat search 2 years later. And you can say, oh, just...
coincidence or not, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. You and I have similar jobs in that we both are on the road a lot and both talking about our respective organizations, and I've found that one of the best ways to talk about Elon, as I'll do in New York next week and Baltimore and Boston, is to tell stories. I mean, people will, you can quote statistics and talk about strategic plans, but people love a story, right? And they remember a story that exemplifies a value, something important about the institution. And I know you do the same. So tell me a story about Habitat that connects Habitat with people's hearts and mind.
So it's, you're so right, first of all. I think you need the data, but stories are what actually change hearts. And the great thing with Habitat is we generate a lot of stories, and we've got a bunch of storytellers in the room, but my hope is all of you will have your own great Habitat story. I think it's hard to pick one. One story I just love was from a trip to Brazil a number of years ago, and I was in a small subsistence farming community in northeastern Brazil, and I met this kind of a remarkable woman named Dona Tata, is what everybody in the community called her, and she had no formal leadership role in the community, but she was clearly a major leader had emerged as a major leader in the community, and she told me that this community had faced two really substantial problems. One, they had very poor access to water, very intense rainy season for a couple months, 10 months dry as a bone, and the women and girls would literally spend half a day every day walking over this big hill about 5 kilometers to fetch water and bring it back, and it wasn't very good quality water. So a pretty substantial health issue. And then a second huge problem. There's a disease called Chagas disease, and that I had never heard of prior to that, but it's a beetle, and the families lived in these mud huts, and the mud walls were a breeding ground for these beetles they called kissing bugs, and they would burrow into the skin of children and infect them and either debilitate their heart or kill them over time. So a really horrific illness that impacts tens and tens of thousands of people in that region every year. So Habitat came alongside the community and did what we do, which is we organized, and the families all built one another basic block houses, but moving into a block house with proper walls, cement floor, and a proper roof wiped out the environment for these kissing bugs. So immediately, a huge health impact. And then they designed the roof systems, and with the partnership of the Methodist Church, built large cisterns. And the roof system was designed to capture all the runoff in the rainy season so they could fill up and actually have enough fresh drinking water to take the family through the dry season. And based on those interventions, negotiated with the state government to build the first school and clinic in the community. And then now girls could go to school for the first time. The women suddenly had half their day back. We talked about what skills do you have now that you can spend less time fetching water. And they were really good at embroidery. So we brought in a microfinance partner and a bank who financed and created a small micro enterprise for them to be able to create a supply chain for their embroidery work. And so Habitat has moved on and is replicating this in other communities, but now you've got a self-sustaining community. Women have socioeconomic empowerment. They've got an additional income stream. People are healthy, and the kids are getting educated. And so to me, that's sort of that's what good looks like, and you've got really a self-sustaining community at the end of it with, as we always talk about, that hand up, not a handout. But I love the after story, and I think for me, it's seeing children, who can think about a future now instead of just thinking about, can I survive?
I love that tagline. This is what good looks like. It seems like it fits Habitat really well, doesn't it?
We think so, but we're biased.
We talked earlier about your career, like a lot of people's career, has zigs and zags. But one of the things that we always say to our students here at Elon is that within the relative safety of the Elon community, we hope that during your time here as students that you're going to struggle and maybe even fail at something. Failure builds resiliency. If you haven't pushed yourself to the point in setting a goal for yourself that's so hard that you might not make it, you probably haven't tested yourself enough as a college student, right? It's something that we want you to all do in this environment, because when you're not going to, if you fail at Elon, you're not going to be homeless. You're not going to go without a meal. Somebody's going to be here to support you, to pick you up, to help you get back on your way again. And that's builds resiliency and character. And I'm always interested in asking successful people like yourself, people whom we admire as leaders, about experiences you've had with failure.
It's I think the great thing with failure is you tend to learn more acutely from failure than success. It's harder when you succeed to know exactly what you did that worked. And often when you fail, it's easier to see what you did wrong that didn't work as well, and we tend to be sensitive to it. I've had quite a string of them, actually. The resume cleans those up, so it looks better. Maybe one that, analogy I sometimes use is, how many of you have ever done rock climbing of any kind? One of the lessons I learned in rock climbing is you want to fall relatively early when you're learning to climb, because you actually figure out it's not fatal, and you understand, and if you don't ever fall, you actually get more tense up on the rock, and as you get higher and it gets scarier, you can lock up a little bit. And I think life a lot, the bumps in life can be very much like that. And I had an early kind of embarrassing failure, and some of you may relate to. In college, I ran for student body president, and I lost, and I was kind of the favorite, and it was a big surprise. It was a surprise disappointment to me in a great way. And I think it takes time before you can have enough objectivity to look back on your own experiences, and it took me a while. But if I'm really honest, which I certainly I wasn't aware at the time, I don't think, but if I'm really honest, looking back, I was running because it was something to achieve, not because I had a kind of great thing I wanted to accomplish. It was just a ring to grab that was out. And I think I had good intentions and hopefully would have done a decent job, but it was, I think that was a great wake-up call. And in a similar way, which was less, it was bad luck as much. Sometimes, you know, I've worked on some projects that really failed in quite ugly ways, but I also lost my first job out of business school at Marriott, where I had been promoted, life was great, and the recession hit. This was an earlier recession. All of you have now experienced a big recession. And Marriott, this was a savings and loan crisis, and Marriott was exposed with a huge amount of real estate, and suddenly nearly went bankrupt. And right after it had been kind of company of the year in all these publications, and so they laid off the entire strategic planning team, including me, which was unexpected, and as part of this big cost cutting. And so it was a big surprise. And I think one of the things that was a confidence builder is I ended up getting a kind of a dream job with Disney. So I learned, you know, it was not the world wouldn't come to an end if I lost my job. And I think that actually helped me be a little more relaxed about future changes in terms of making some jumps that looked a little, you know, risky or uncertain, and may have, you know, paved the way to be a little more comfortable later making what seemed like riskier changes.
Well, great. Thank you for that. I was bragging at dinner about these students and this generation of students, which I find to be a very inspiring generation. And it's amazing to me to think about the ways that they incorporate service into their lives after Elon. Some do AmeriCorps, City Year, Teach for America. Some commit to a profession of public service, public school teaching, or work in a local or state or federal government. And others find a way to build service into their lives when they're doing something else professionally, perhaps in the for-profit world. But I'm interested in how you think we're doing at colleges and universities, and what we could do to reach more students, to think about ways that as people are designing their lives, as they are thinking about the kind of people they want to be, the way that they're going to live out their values in the communities in which they live, that they can plan for service to be a part of who they are. Because it's our aspiration that people will point to these young people out in the world and say, that is a good person, and she went to Elon. So what do you see colleges need to do more of to create that kind of civil society?
I think first, the good news. I mean, I'm blown away by what you're already doing, and I think it's fantastic. And I think there's intentionality around service learning that is radically different than it was a generation back or 2 generations back. And so I'm very inspired by, and one of the reasons I like to talk to young people is there is such an interest and heart for service. I think it's interesting. One is just the most basic. Anybody know do you know the number one reason people volunteer? Because somebody asked them to. And it's so basic, and yet it's amazing. It's actually also the number one reason people give. Our founder was famous for saying, you know, I've tried asking and not asking. Turns out asking works better. It is, and actually that's very true to volunteering and service, that most people end up volunteering because somebody says, hey, I'm doing this and I'm really excited about it. Why don't you come along and check it out? And the great news is if people get that early opportunity to serve in a meaningful way and have a good experience, then that tends to become a part of their long-term pattern. And unfortunately, empirically, the opposite is true as well. If you don't do that, it takes a much kind of more intense intervention to kind of convert somebody later on who didn't have that experience or model from their parents or environment. So I think, you know, what things you seem to be doing so well is celebrating it. So holding up, telling stories, you know, being clear. You know, I think I see organizations all the time. Almost every organization has values around service or values around. And then the question is, do you actually build it into the DNA of the organization? How do you reward people? What do you celebrate? What are the metrics? How do you, you know, is it real when people sort of peek beneath the covers? And I think it seems like you're doing all those pieces. And the other part I think is is terrific, and thank you to all the students who are helping Habitat and other great organizations, is there's a little bit of a tendency that I both admire and cringe at, which is every student feels the need to start their own new nonprofit. And we have, millions of nonprofits in the country, and most of them aren't having much impact. And actually there are so fantastic to partner up with organizations across this community and region that are already having impact and feed them to have more impact, because we need to find things that work and then do them at a much larger scale, if I think, to change society. But it is, the other side I would say is both use your hands and your voices, we need more advocates. But I think actually we could probably learn more from you, but it is how do you send signals? And as I understand it, in a way, your transcript is a great example, which is it's not lip service. If it actually is going to show up at least. Now, there's no heart measure to show if somebody's got a converted heart, but it's a pretty impressive indicator if you've got this many people who are actually getting their hands dirty.
More important, I think, is the narrative that our students tell. The transcript reveals important activity, but if the students have really reflected on it, on their service, on their international study, in a serious way, and thought about ways that those experiences connect with their academic experiences, they have a powerful story to tell as they're preparing to leave Elon. And I think that's the most effective test right there.
I think it's fantastic. And and the great thing is it's selfishly a positive thing. The data is overwhelmingly, once you have kind of enough money that you're not going hungry, there's very low correlation to more money and more happiness. There's incredible correlation to service and happiness and fulfillment. So it's so you get to actually be selfish and make the world better. It's actually a fabulous combination.
And speaking of not necessarily having to reinvent the wheel or a new nonprofit, some of the students in this room and I, one afternoon, a very hot afternoon in the summer, were pulling weeds at Peacehaven Farms, which is just over the county line in Guilford County. It's a new venture in partnership with Habitat to build an absolutely beautiful home for disabled adults. And these are people that are going to go off, instead of going off to college, they're going to go off to Peacehaven Farms. They're going to run an active and working farm. They're going to contribute. They're going to grow their own food. They're going to preserve their own food. And they're going to live with pride and a relatively high degree of independence. It's such an inspiring example. And I'm wondering about other examples like that for Habitat that you could tell us about, because I think we all tend to pigeonhole organizations in certain ways, and I think of a Habitat house typically one way. And this example this summer taught me that, wow, now here's a whole other approach to housing that is really cool. I grew up with a severely disabled sister in my own family, and what an opportunity like that just didn't exist when she needed it. What else is happening along those lines to partner with Habitat to do good in the world?
Oh, it's I think we're at a really exciting stage in Habitat. It is. I always laugh. The two myths about Habitat are that President Carter started and runs Habitat, and that we give away houses. So neither of those turn out to be true, but there but it is. I think we've got a few themes. We launched a big new strategy about a year ago that really is wanting to do more of what we've always done, but do it in a way that amplifies the impact. And so some things that people may not know about Habitat, I think, that are pretty exciting. One is that in some ways Habitat was a social entrepreneurship story before it was cool to be a social entrepreneur. So it's in some ways it's always been designed to be a self-sustaining program. And some of our best affiliates now, actually, if they didn't want to grow, could fully fund themselves off their mortgage portfolios and their restores. And for those of you who don't, I hope you've got a local restore, so hopefully you're all aware. That's now a $300 million business that netted $110 million last year and kept 250,000 tons out of landfills. So what a neat, I think it's a great story. We think that could be properly run and grown. We think that can be a $1 billion business, which would have a significant impact on our ability to continue to grow much faster than we can grow our philanthropy. So that's a big engine. Another area we're excited about is really the can we change the housing sector beyond the direct community work? We want to do more of our direct community work than ever, but when you look at 1.5 billion people in the world living in substandard or poverty housing, you know, we're now doing 10x the number of, serving 10 times the number of families we were 9 years ago. So that's pretty dramatic growth, but it's still not gonna, even if we kept growing at that rate, we're never gonna touch the scale of need even, and we're the largest private home builder in the US now. But so in many, now in about 30 countries, we're pioneering housing microfinance to try to get the microfinance industry to start housing lending so that very, very low income families, the $2 and $3 a day families, can get small loans to be able to get a new roof, to get a cement floor, to be able to expand, to have a room to keep the boys and girls separate, or maybe run a small business out of their house. And over time, or to get water, or to get sanitation, and we think over time, with a series of loans, we can actually, then those families can ultimately get to something that meets all the standards for decent housing, but on terms they can afford, and therefore we can scale that at a level. If we could actually, just for example, if we could get the microfinance industry to go from 1% housing loans to 10% housing loans, we'd be unleashing $3 to $4 billion of loan capital for very small, for very low income families. And you start thinking about what that could do in terms of moving the needle. So I'm excited about that. Habitat Nepal, I think, is our most audacious example. They've gone from directly building 200 houses a year to figuring out partnerships and advocacy programs. They had 800,000 young people come out in one weekend to lobby the federal government and the states in Nepal. They got the state to create a housing finance fund. They've now they've gone from 200 to 26,000 houses. And now they've set a goal of 1 million houses by 2020, and that's audacious. You know, that's pretty exciting in terms of impact. That would actually reduce the housing deficit in the country by 20%. And to me, that's a big idea.
It's a great idea. It's a great idea. Fabulous. We were talking privately downstairs earlier tonight about the sad and tragic news that came out of Chapel Hill last week. And you run a major international brand, and I'm sure that you reflected yourself about organizations in crisis, and how to steer away from those shoals. What are your thoughts about when you see an organization that's experiencing the kind of trauma that our friends at UNC are painfully going through right now? What are your thoughts as somebody who leads an international corporation with a platinum brand?
You know, it's first, I mean, as somebody who grew up on campus, basically, it's just heartbreaking. And I read the whole painful report late one night last week, and I would say it's interesting at both a personal and institutional level. One of the most interesting observations and painful observations is one of the reasons they didn't catch it sooner was there was a disbelief that, you know, it just was inconceivable that such a thing could actually happen. And I would say, first at a personal level, the first step to getting into real trouble is to say, that could never happen to me. And I believe that individuals and organizations need ferocious systems of accountability. And it's not because you don't trust people, it's actually because we're all capable of doing really bad things if we don't. And I would say, you know, for every one of you, one of my dearest wishes is that you would have at least one, if not a small group of people who love you enough to tell you the unvarnished truth and hold you accountable and ask you all the uncomfortable questions you really never want anyone to ask you. Because just knowing that they'll ask will actually keep you from doing, from stepping off the path. And when you look at either individuals or institutions that do these terrible things, it's very rare that people set out going, I'm going to go do this terrible thing. It's actually, you know, if you ever do orienteering or driving, you know, how do you end up in totally the wrong place? It's a whole series of very small missteps that slowly, and you end up in a completely different direction than you ever imagined. And I think the same thing can be true institutionally. And, you know, just the smallest examples. When I went into to serve at our church, the first thing we did is I just said, as a flat rule, there will be no rooms in the church that don't have windows, because not that I don't trust anybody, but we are going to have a openness and transparency, and so that it's just very clear that everything at the church is open, and therefore, and that's I think to me that's a principal issue, but it also just protects people from even the potential of being in a compromising situation. We actually take that same policy at Habitat as well, and it creates. And I'm just a big fan of sunlight. But you need systems, and the bigger you get, the more you actually need systems of accountability, because I think even well-intentioned people can steer off course. And actually, the purpose of guardrails isn't. You hope you never run. And usually, if you think about where a guardrail is, it's not at the cliff edge. It's a little bit in front of the cliff. And the whole idea is you bang the guardrail before you go over the cliff. And that's why I think we all institutions need guardrails, and so do people. That
is fantastic advice, and something for us all to bear in mind as we lead institution or lead our individual lives. Well said. Thank you. I wanted to give you an opportunity for any final thought that you might want to share, particularly with our Elon students here tonight.
What I would say, I want to share a piece of advice I got in graduate school that was so surprising to me, but I hope it will be encouraging to those who, particularly those who don't actually know what you're going to do when you get out of college, and who are feeling pressured about that. The first thing, going back to my very first comment, is if first is who, and sort of what kind of person do you want to be, and I think God cares much more about that than what we do. Not that what we do isn't important. When you think about what you do. Frederick Buechner is another favorite writer, and his definition of calling I really liked. He said, your calling is where the deep gladness of your heart and the world's great need meet. Where the deep gladness of your heart and the world's great need meet. So your job, and it may take you a long time, is to figure that out. And that is the most important thing you have to do over the next long period of time. And some of you may already know what that is. Some of you may be more like me, and it just takes you a meandering path to figure that out over time. But it's really important to figure that out. And I think that's, I used to say find your passion. I actually don't think that's true. If I was only focused on my passion, it would be all about college basketball. But I'm not. I think it's deeper than passion. It's really purpose. It's what is your avocation, your calling, your purpose, and why were you born to, what were you born to do on this earth? And I had a great privilege in graduate school of having a leadership seminar with a man named John Gardner. Maybe familiar with some of you. He was an incredible social entrepreneur, worked for a number of presidents, was a very accomplished guy. And he said, it doesn't matter what you do under the age of 30, just try as many things as you can and gain as much as experience as you possibly can. And just look at your 20s as continuing education. And I thought that was fantastic. And it was liberating in the sense that it didn't matter quite as much to find the perfect job that had exactly everything as much as to sort of stretch and find as many different ways, both direct in job, but also in your volunteering and out-of-work opportunities to learn as much as you can. And then ultimately you figure out how that times together. He was a psychologist, and then before going into this very distinguished public service career and then launching, he started Common Cause and the independent sector, and then became a very popular teacher at the very end. So it's so there may be all sorts of surprises along the way, but I would focus much more on how much experience can you gain than having the perfect job. Though I would try to pick as much as possible, pick a culture that aligns with who with your values and where you want to be, because I do think that's important.
I do have one more question. What's your step goal on your job on?
I laugh. I think I got given this, and it's 10,000. I'm actually really good at getting my 10,000. The problem is the sleep part. I'm failing miserable, and it just tells me every day I'm continuing to fail at it, which is not very encouraging.
I did too, and you know what I did? I lowered my goal.
Better strategy. I think that's what I'll do.
Not good advice.
I want to feel good. Contingency plan.
Jonathan Reckford, thank you for visiting Elon University. It's been an honor and privilege for you to be our guest tonight.
Thank you. Great to be here. Thanks to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure.